In the next couple of slideshows, we're going to consider various aspects of Hobbes's political philosophy. In this slideshow, we'll focus on competing conceptions of human nature. As you may have gathered, Hobbes has a rather negative view of human nature, or at least he thinks that given the limited natures that we have, in a variety of ordinary circumstances, we'll behave rather brutally. So we're going to compare this view of Hobbes to a competing view offered by Howard Zinn. Howard Zinn doesn't exactly advance a view of human nature. What he does instead is suggest that, contrary to Hobbes, violence is not part of human nature, or at least that there's no evidence that violence is part of human nature. Here's a sketch of how we'll proceed. First, we'll go through an introduction where we sketch out what we mean when we say something is or is not part of human nature. Then we'll consider evidence that violence is part of human nature. And then we'll consider evidence that perhaps we're not so bad after all. So here's a sketch of the introduction. I'm not going to read through it. We're just going to jump in by recounting what Hobbes has to say about human nature. So Hobbes makes one straightforward claim about human nature, and it's this: that self-preservation is our ultimate motivation. Remember, he calls this the law of nature. The law of nature dictates that one ought to preserve oneself. And why ought one preserve oneself? Because, premise one, self-preservation is our fundamental motivation. Premise two, if self-preservation is our fundamental motivation, then one ought to preserve oneself, or ought to seek to survive. Therefore, one ought to preserve oneself. So Hobbes is committed to this claim that self-preservation is our fundamental motivation as part of his argument for the claim that there is this law of nature. And that law then plays a role in his political philosophy. He also argues that we aren't predisposed to cooperate. When does he say this? Well, remember, after he decides that we should escape the war of all against all, he asks, how can we do it? How can we manage to escape the war of all against all? And one suggestion he makes is that we could look to animals and see how it is that they manage to get along. After all, wolves aren't always killing each other, so what do? And when in that consideration, he says there's a crucial difference between animals and us. Unlike animals, we aren't predisposed to cooperate. We don't have built-in mechanisms that allow us to cooperate. So there's another claim about human nature to which Hobbes is committed. Finally, he suggests that given our nature, each person will regularly behave violently towards others, unless she fears punishment from an authority. Now, this is crucial to Hobbes's political philosophy. He uses this claim to argue that we need a bludgeon, that we need some sort of power to punish us for getting out of line. After all, if people wouldn't behave violently towards others, or would only occasionally behave violently towards others, perhaps the best society would be one in which there isn't a bludgeon, in which there isn't a power able to punish people for deviating from contracts. And sorry, I said finally, but there's a couple more claims here, or maybe just this one. One person will help another only if the helper consciously calculates a way that helping would benefit him or her. Now, Hobbes allows some small exceptions to this. Remember, he talked about the natural lust that allows families to be a unit. So in the case of families, perhaps this fourth claim doesn't hold. But he thinks outside of the family unit, this claim will hold. That is, because self-preservation is your fundamental motivation, you're only going to help someone else if you think that it will benefit you to do so. Now, Zinn has a very different view on human nature. And I'm introducing Howard Zinn here without saying anything about him. He's a historian who also was involved in a variety of interesting events in the 20th century. I'll talk about some of that in a separate little slideshow where I talk about his life, the way I did earlier for Hobbes, and the way I did for Kant and Mill as well. So here's what Hobbes has to say about relevant claims. Here's what Zinn has to say about relevant claims from Hobbes. He says that, in fact, there are no good arguments for the conclusion that aggression and violence are parts of human nature. And it's important that you notice that he's not saying this. He's not saying that there is good evidence that cooperation is part of our nature. That's not the claim at issue here. He's not saying there isn't evidence for that, but he's not saying that there is evidence for that. Instead, he's just saying that there's no evidence that aggression is part of our nature. More generally, Zinn is very skeptical of the idea of human nature, at least the idea that there are morally significant or politically significant aspects to human nature. So we'll stop this brief segment there and continue next time by talking about what human nature is.